All right, welcome back to We Play Games. Here we are about to discuss a Humankind Ancient Era tier list. But I think before we discuss the Ancient Era cultures, we do very briefly need to go over what you're sacrificing. So here we have a Neolithic character. We're playing on normal speed, and so the amount of food that you need is significantly increased. But you're still trying to maximize the amount you can grow. And one of the things that the hunting party in the Neolithic era offers you that almost none of the ancient era cultures offer you. Units that when they fight animals, they gain food. And that's going to allow them to grow population for you without any regular food income. But you can do that pretty easily. If you can find and identify a hunting ground and utilize it, you can get a lot of pops pretty quickly. Animal fights, especially mammoth hunts, are insanely good in the Neolithic era. You get 20 influence for them, versus in the ancient era you only get 20 money. 20 money is considerably less useful than 20 influence, at least at the beginning, because you really do want to grab as much territory as you can. And that approach means that there's this weird tension when it comes to when you should switch into the ancient era. Some of the cultures are definitely a lot stronger than some of the other ones, and so you don't want to miss out on all of the good cultures, but you also don't want to give up your Neolithic tribesmen too early, because they're incredibly strong when it comes to growing your population. And then when you come into the ancient era, you can disband a lot of your tribes into your city. Your city can immediately be chugging out and getting you tons of money and tons of science, and then getting you powered through the ancient era as quickly as possible, which I think is generally what you should be doing in the ancient era. Churn through it, get to the classical era. The classical era is where you can hit some really insanely strong cultures. And so I think that the approach that you should take when it comes to ancient era cultures is find something that's going to efficiently get you from point A to B as fast as you can. And so with that in mind, let's start with the Assyrians. The Assyrians, they're an expansionist culture, which means that they can spend gold to steal territories from people. You're also going to get a lot of extra fame here because you're going to expand a whole lot with anybody in the ancient era, hopefully, but especially someone with an expansionist star here. Your carryover ability, your legacy ability, is, I think, one of the best ones in the ancient era. +1 land movement speed on unit is incredibly strong because of the way it allows you to outflank your opponents in combat. It really is sort of like you always get rear attacks if rear attacks are possible. It's very, very powerful when it comes to conducting combat. And so for that note, I think that the Assyrians automatically are a mediocre civ based off of this alone. Danu is okay. +3 influence on your garrison is good. Influence is one of the most important things at the beginning of the game because that's what you need in order to make outposts. See, it costs us 5 influence to found our first outpost, and then it'll be more and more as we have more and more outposts founded. And so getting influence from something is definitely useful. Unfortunately, garrisons are generally not that good, and so this is kind of a throwaway. The garrison does make it so that if you find that your target that you're trying to eat is very far away because you're playing on a huge map or you rolled something weird, then Danu can be helpful, but it's not really any more helpful than any other garrison, which can also be used as a land unit spawn. And then the Assyrian raiders are pretty ignorable. Generally speaking, I think you shouldn't be building cavalry in the ancient era, except if you have an emblematic chariot. If you have an emblematic chariot, then consider it. But these guys, I don't know. They can't attack cities, and that's what you want to do. Either you want to be founding tons of outposts, conquering other people's cities, or maybe both, because that's the way that you get the most culture total in the ancient era, is by either being a steed, taking people's cities, or both. The Assyrians, as it turns out, literally the only thing I'm evaluating them on is this, but I think the +1 land movement speed is pretty good, so I think for that, they're going to go into okay situational. I think they're at the bottom of, or maybe the middle of the pack here. But if you find yourself in a situation where you ended up in the Neolithic era for a relatively long time and you have a huge horde and there's a bunch of settled weaklings near you, the Assyrians are pretty good because if your units are faster than your opponents, you can get around them pretty easily. And then you can beat them up in combat. So I think okay situational is fine for them. Babylonians, they are a scientific culture. They get +2 science per research technology on capital. Don't think about that too hard. What that really means is if you have 3 technologies, then you get 1 free pop in your capital that's always a scientist. And if you have 6 research technologies, then you have 2 permanent locked scientists, etc., etc. But it's really the first couple that are so important. There's a lot of hemming and hawing about whether or not this is good in the late game. It's not. It's terrible in the late game, but that doesn't matter. Like, it's not about whether it's good in the late game or the early game. If it gives you a free population in the early game, that's pretty good. But unfortunately, the astronomy house is like pretty question marks. +3 science per adjacent farmer's quarter means that in order to really get the most value out of an astronomy house, what you need to do is you need to set yourself up with like an outpost here, an outpost there, and then like 2 astronomy houses here that can share 2 farmers' quarters. And if you can make that like cross formation with your astronomy houses, then you can get a lot of value out of them, but you kind of need to be able to make that cross formation because otherwise, like, how are you getting good value out of these? They're really expensive in terms of industry, and they don't give you any influence, and they don't give you any industry, and they don't really even give you any extra food. They like only barely give you extra food because of farmers' quarters. So astronomy houses, I think, are largely only going to be powerful in the event that you're playing on like insanely slow tech levels, but like normally not good. The Sabusakasi are really good though. Like, look at these guys, they're 22 strength. The spearmen are normally 18. Spearmen are usually weaker than warriors. These guys are not. They're a lot stronger than warriors. So Babylonians, I think if you have some sources of bronze near you, then I think that these guys are pretty strong. Just because this is a really beefy spear person to beat somebody down with, and I think that beating people down in the ancient era, that's generally useful. And so combining that with this technology bonus, which is hopefully going to get you to your bronze working faster, and then hopefully help you find your bronze faster. I think they're a reasonable rush civilization, but that's kind of where they are. I'm not super thrilled with them. I think that generally speaking, they're about the same level as the Assyrians. I think overall, I would put the Babylonians in front of the Syrians. Next up, we have the Bantu. The Bantu are a really weird one because of their unique unit here. It's a Bagendi Pioneer, and it has the Nomad special ability, which is just like the tribes. And so the Bagendi Pioneers are going to grow as they continue to do battle with everybody. And they also have the Mupia Fields, which automatically upgrades regular outpost. +10 food on adjacent cities means that you don't have to attach the Mupia Field to your city in order to get food on your city, which means that the food on the Mupia Field remains there. That allows them to use the pops that are there to make more Bagendi Pioneers, which is important because the way they work is you get up to 4, and then you can settle those 4 pioneers into 1 outpost, but you can't spend influence on outpost generation anymore. So you kind of have to use your influence in your Mupia Fields to make Bagendi Pioneers to go out and settle tons of territory. And it's actually a pretty powerful combination of things, but you need like a ridiculous setup to really maximize it, because you want to have like an infinite amount of Bagendi Pioneers, really, and then you want to make it so that you have like tons of outposts surrounding one city, and then another city somewhere else that again hasn't been attached to anything and therefore can spend all of its industry building districts because it has tons of extra stability. But like you don't have a special district to build, so you're just building regular makers quarters or whatever, and then your harmonious amalgamation +2 influence per number of adjacent empires is very whatever, because you just don't want to have that many adjacent empires on territories. These guys really are the heroes of the squad. They're really strong. If you can use a group of 3 of them to bully your opponents and like attack their scouts and kill them, and then turn them into food, and grow your population off of theirs, you can choke them very, very effectively. And I think that's like the main strength of the Bantu, but you really do need to be in a brutal land battle for them to be good. So I think overall, because the Bantu are so good when you're in a brutal land battle and you're trying to fight for food and territory, I don't think I can rate them as being awful, but they are extremely mediocre and very narrow. If somebody has seen extremely powerful gameplay with the Bantu, let me know. I think the biggest way that I would probably upgrade them is make it 3 Begendi Pioneers to found an outpost rather than 4, so that way the stack doesn't disappear. And next up we have the Caralans. The Caralans have this cooperative spirit thing that's going to follow with you throughout the game, +1 food on adjacencies, +1 industry, money, science. So they're going to reward you a lot for building a whole lot of districts, but they're not going to discount you to get there. You also don't have any influence down here. You don't have any industry down here. You're missing a lot of the tools that people traditionally need to have a powerful civilization, but they do have a really good emblematic building. This ceremonial plaza has resource exploitation, and it allows you to build like without adjacencies, and it's a little bit of extra faith too, which faith can be pretty strong. Like if it gets you to the resources, and one of the reasons that faith is pretty strong is that it can get you to the resources that you don't currently have, because it can supplement in ways that are non-random and choosable. And so having something that gets you extra faith is neat. But their emblematic unit is kind of nonsense, like healing outside of friendly territories to all units in the army doesn't really do a lot, because most of the time your units are going to end up inside your own territory, and if they don't, then why aren't you conquering territory from people? Or where are your units if they're not in friendly territory? And so I think because their spirit isn't particularly good, and their ceremonial plaza, although the ceremonial plaza is quite powerful, I think I'm going to put the Caralans as being aspirational. I think have anyone who has an early Hamlet like ability can't be that bad. So maybe they're above. Yeah, they're probably here, because early Hamlets are basically always good. But overall, I think that the bonuses that you get from playing Caralan just don't justify taking it over any of the stronger civilizations. And so it's one of those things where it's like, all right, you're playing with 8 CPUs and you only have 4 choices left. Caralan's not that bad. Unlike the Egyptians. Now, like, some people are gonna like scream and holler that they're not an OP, but I promise they aren't. And the reason is that they don't solve influence as well as they should. So Egyptians, the reason that Egyptians are good is this ability. This ability is absolutely fantastic. It's basically half of a pyramids that you get for free without having to invest anything, plus extra industry on tiles producing industry is really, really strong. It's just extra bonuses. Same with your Egyptian pyramid, tons of extra industry here. And industry is very good, and here we have ranged units. These ones are pretty aspirational because you need 2 horse and 1 bronze. I think that largely by the time that you're there, I wonder how much longer you're going to be in the ancient era. But the problem with the Egyptians is that these are not going to help you capture cities particularly well. They'll help you win land battles, and that's very, very strong, but they won't capture cities very well. But then they also only get 1 influence from pyramids, and they aren't scaling 1 influence either. It's a flat 1 influence, whereas there are some other ones where it's like +1 influence for every adjacent blah blah blah. Nope, this is just +1 influence, and +1 influence is not enough for you to have a meaningful way to go wide. And so if you take the Egyptians, then you're kind of locking yourself into the same sort of strategies that the Egyptians had to employ in real life, which was make maximum value out of the minimum amount of territory that they have available to them, which is admirable, and they do a great job with that. But rather than getting locked on 4 tiles where you have been able to build Egyptian pyramids everywhere, you should try to just get as much land as you can. Because of how insanely expensive their units are and how they don't really help you with influence at all, I don't think that it is appropriate to rate the Egyptians as being any higher than good. But I do think that they are very good, and I'm never embarrassed to be taking them, but it's scary, because like if you're taking the Egyptians, you are playing exclusively for making maximum value out of the territory that you currently have. You're much better off just getting a bunch of land. Speaking of getting a bunch of land, we have the Harappans. So the Harappans get a bunch of land because they have a whole bunch of food. And then somebody says, well, Walker, you just said that you need to get a bunch of influence. Well, we are going to be getting a bunch of influence, chat, because you get influence from pops, and you get more pops from having more food. And you get tons of extra food playing as the Harappans, like really just a shameful amount of extra food because of the combination of +1 food on river, and your canal networks counting as a river, and extra food per adjacent farmers' quarters. Like, all the Harappans do is give you infinite food, but with air quotes around all, because with infinite food, you're going to have just a giant amount of influence that you can throw at grabbing territories on the board. And you just need to keep your stability relatively high. But fortunately, one of the ways that you can keep your stability relatively high is by having garrisoned troops. And your runners are pretty effective. These are pretty sweet scouts. 14 5s are no joke, and if you need to use them to like pincer your opponents and kill one of their scouts as they're walking around, then you absolutely can, because you got 14 strength, buddy. So I really think that Harappans, if you're not going to go with a strategy that's militarily conquering somebody or aesthetically like bombing them out, then Harappans are the way to go. But I do think that generally speaking, they're going to be a little bit weaker than some of the strongest factions out here. I don't want to call them OP. All right, so next up we have the Hittites. The Hittites, they have this Lust for War ability, +1 combat strength on unit, and then 20 of the FIMs for each owned city per occupied city. That's a little weird. I think the Hittites really are one of these, if you want to meme it and try to do a world conquest in like 20 turns, you can probably do that with Hittites, because all it means is get 2 or 3 cities, and then every city after that just leave unoccupied, and you'll get an insane amount of extra growth. Even like just a couple of turns of your capital getting an extra 20 industry means that you can rush out some ridiculous starts by using the Hittites and using an occupied city. And so this Lust for War, and of course they get +1 combat strength on unit, which is pretty beefy in the beginning of the game, and it drops off towards the end, as you'd expect. But like that bonus on its own, I think, is pretty good. Unfortunately, Gigir, this is, again, same problem with the Egyptians. This is an insanely expensive unit. 2 horse, 1 bronze, and then you're going to need domestication and wheel and bronze working to make use of this. Like, good luck. That's going to be really slow. They are very powerful in combat, though, so if you can get to the point where you can use them, then they are very powerful. But be aware that they are heavy cavalry, so they are unable to climb fortifications. You cannot use them to attack enemy cities very well. They kind of just march around the outside of the city yelling insults in, and sometimes they get attacked. The Awari here, the biggest thing about them is they do have resource exploitation, and that's pretty good. Like, anything that provides resource exploitation, a Hamlet-like ability, I think can't be that bad. Any sort of Hamlet ability, cough, Hamlet ability, is really, like, something that makes me interested in playing them already. And like, +3 money on top of the Hamlet ability is no joke. So I think that the combination of their Awari being pretty good, their Gigir being good but expensive and situational, but then their ability being like extremely powerful if you can make good use of it, and very bad if you can't, means that I think that overall the Hittites are a pretty mediocre. I think they're stronger than the Bantu, but I think that there's a really wide delta. Actually, you know what? I think they're probably better than the Assyrians. Yeah, they're probably better than the Assyrians. I mean, we're gonna end up with a bell curve here, by the way, because like they do have a Hamlet ability, and Hamlet abilities are just like almost always good. It's really hard to rate somebody with a Hamlet as being bad. And then like on the other side of it, you have the Mycenaeans, who are just like so good at exactly what they do, which is like thrashing people, that it automatically puts them in the top tier, I think, because minus 20% unit industry cost means that you can pump out units in the ancient era way easier. Like you can just get 4 and 5 stacks as fast as you can. Plus the stacks that you get are going to be most of these Promachoi, which I think are one of the best ancient era units that you can get, because you get them on city defense, so you get them insanely early in the game. Plus they are outrageously strong. Champions stronger when attacking during the first round is no joke. Like these guys basically fight as swordsmen on the first round, which no one in the game is going to be able to compete with until they get like Gigir on turn like 15 or whatever. Your Mycenaean warriors are just going to body people. And then you also have some pretty nice bonuses here, because your Cyclopean Fortress is a really strong district. It's an industry hamlet, so it doesn't get you any extra food, but it does get you 5 extra stability, and it also delays the opponent in the event that they are trying to invade you for whatever reason. More important than that, it's a land unit spawn, so it's a way for you to take your Promachoi and just kind of like drop them right next to your opponents. Build a Cyclopean Fortress really, really close to your enemy city. Build a 4 stack of these. Send them at the enemy city. Watch them collapse. Dust off your hands. So yeah, Mycenaeans, they do require an enemy nearby for them to be worth taking. Without that, they are pretty bad, because you really want to be making use of Brutal Upbringing to just like clobber your opponents early. On that note, you need to have a long Neolithic where you get a reasonable number of pops to really make use of them, because you want to be able to disband some scouts and then re-raise them as a Promachoi. But if you can meet those requirements, these guys are monstrously powerful. The only thing that, again, I have going against them is that they are situational. You need people to be pretty close. Next up, we have the Nubians. The Nubians are, I think, really interesting because the Nubians start you down a different path. So most of the time, whenever you're trying to gain territory, you are trying to gain it through influence. But if you get into land rights, inherited land, where you modify the way that you manage your territories by getting it with money instead of influence, really the only thing that should be on here is medieval or above, because if you don't have at least 5 territories, I don't know what's going on. But if you get to 5 territories and you're in medieval, then you can go into inherited land. Then you can spend money to gain territory on the world. If you can do that, rush through to the medieval era and get to where you can buy land with money, then having as much money as possible when you reach that point is really good. And on that note, the Nubians are A+ at that. And even if because you don't have to like sit on this gold forever, you can use gold to buy districts and buildings and build up your cities insanely fast, like faster than you could if you were just using industry. And this is going to get you a ton of extra gold. It's going to get you almost 1 pop worth of extra gold for each resource deposit, right? You get +6 money for 1 pop working in money in a city, and so this is +5 money and doesn't eat any food. So just the ability alone on Nubians is absolutely bananas. But then they also have a dual quarter. Dual quarters are really, really good because they're crazy flexible. And they always give you some kind of like neat little bonus in terms of getting you like an extra job slot or something like that. The only thing that's a little weird about them is that you get +3 money per adjacent maker's quarter instead of extra industry, and so they are going to make you have less total industry overall. But don't think about that as a bad thing, because again, you can plow money back into industry, but that allows you to move the industry from city to city to city, because you can get a ton of industry, or air quotes around industry money in your capital, and then use it to develop your second city by just by buying a bunch of districts. They also have Tasseti archers, which are just like insane. These guys are insane. What is happening here? They can shoot at a target without having a clear line of sight to it. And so if you have like weird bad territory near you with lots of cliff faces and stuff like that, Tasseti archers are gonna absolutely mulch your opponents. But overall, I think the Nubians are very strong because of these free pops. This is crazy cheap, like just crazy, crazy cheap. And of course, you do have the ability to spend tons of influence to get tons of money in the event that you're crazy. Generally speaking, you want to be using your influence to expand, even if you're trying to go into inherited land. But I think that if you can get enough money from it, then it can be worth it, because money can be reinvested into infrastructure, which can get you a ton of extra growth. Overall, I'm going to put the Nubians as actually above Egyptians, below Harappans. I think that the fact that you get so many free pops, air quotes, free pops from your base ability that requires zero investment in, means that you can actually have tons of extra pops in the forms of lots of extra influence and instability by just buying things for your people. You also have a very powerful and very inexpensive military unit, which I love. But I think generally speaking, because it literally doesn't get you any sort of influence at all, I can't put it being above Harappan. All right, we got Olmecs. Olmecs, we're going to drop right here just to skip ahead to it. Olmecs. What do they have? They have the Cultural Blitz ability, which is the best ability in the game, I think, because it lets you just exchange like a handful of money for 3 territories in a city, and then you can just keep doing it. So this ability is just absolutely bonkers, and I think they really do kind of set the pace for the ancient era, at least in my opinion. Either one of the Estate powers, either the Olmecs or the Zhou. But the Olmecs do things a little differently. They get +3 influence on territory, so they reward you even more for going wide, which I think is actually why I think they're the strongest now. Then after Natural Harmony, we also have the Olmec Head, which I think is one of the strongest emblematic buildings in the game. It is basically just a farmer's quarter on the surface, but in reality, it's a lot better than that. It exploits food, but it generates influence, and it generates extra influence per adjacent farmer's quarter. Now, I kind of bashed the Babylonians for having a similar effect, but I think influence is way, 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 way more important than science in the ancient era, because influence lets you grab outposts and then attach those to cities, and then you get industry and food, and then you grow really quickly, and then you get out of the ancient era as quickly as possible, and science doesn't do that. And so I think that the fact that the Olmec Head doesn't generate any industry obviously holds it back a little bit, but you should be able to get tons of industry from all of the territories that you're gaining as the Olmecs, and if you're not, then you should be thinking a little more carefully about where you're placing your outposts, because you can very easily put outposts down that generate 15 plus infant industry without thinking too hard about it, and then you can use your Olmec heads to get more food. But more importantly, to get more influence and therefore get more territory, and so on and so forth. You also have a pretty good unit here in javelin throwers. Javelin throwers, I think, are strong because they do have a pretty high unit combat strength, and they have stronger on forest tiles, and so you don't need nearly as much screening when you're using javelin throwers as you do if you're using the Tassetti archers of the Nubians. You can kind of use like 3 ones where you have 3 javelin throwers and 1 melee unit without feeling too embarrassed, because they can rumble. They can rumble simply because they have this outrageous bonus in terms of natural harmony, as well as a very powerful Olmec head and the Estate bonus. I think that the Olmecs are the strongest individual culture here in the ancient era. All right, skipping back to here, we're going to look at the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are another merchant ability, so if you're trying to get like tons of money a la the Nubians, then these look like on the surface they would be pretty similar, but they really do lean into their coastal roots. The biggest thing they have going for them is that they can use the Haven emblematic building, which is another hamlet sort of, but it's a hamlet that requires the fishing technology, and generally speaking you're not going to have a haven that's going to be able to exploit a lot of industry. So I think the Haven, although it is a nice little bonus here, the fact that everything relies on like navy stuff and you don't get any extra influence or industry, and the fact that your emblematic unit here, the Byreme, isn't going to come up that often unless you're playing on a high water map, the Phoenicians really are just sort of unrateable I'm gonna be forced to put them in awful, but I think in reality they're not awful. They're either awful or somewhere around high good, where if there's tons of water going on, then they are in fact very powerful. But if there's like a normal amount of water going on, then they're pretty bad. Because you really do need to be able to make use of their ability to not sink in deep water, but simply be damaged by deep water. But that requires there be like just lots of water around, and like that's very slow. Moving it 2 tiles per turn is a lot worse than moving it 5 tiles per turn, even if it gets you to weird places. So next up we have the Sumerians. I don't have that DLC, so we are going to discuss them with the big caveat that I've never actually played them before, and so I'm going to be assessing them from a very different perspective. And unfortunately, because of the emblematic district that they have here, saying +3 influence when a leverage intel is collected on an empire, I can't really judge the Sumerians here because I don't know how frequently that's going to trigger. And the science per adjacent main plaza or administrative center is very promising. Like, that's an entire free population for each of those that you hit. And so that combination plus attached territory cost per remaining city cap count, but it's going to save you a little bit of influence. The promise of potential free pops and maybe lots of extra influence, I don't know how often this leverage intel can trigger, means that I think that Sumerians are probably at least a good, like at least okay situational actually, but I don't want to rate them, so we will hold them off for now. But if you've played with them and have any opinion, let me know. Then we're going to judge the Zhou as our last. The Zhou are another estate, which is going to help you just grab tons and tons of territory and then slap those onto your cities and have tons and tons of industry. And so the Zhou are automatically going to be one of the strongest in the game, but they are kind of in a weird space. So you get +2 stability on district, which is nice. It means that you can build much like wider cities in terms of districts than you would with anybody else. But you can also get stability from just garrisoning troops. And so stability isn't like the most important thing in the universe. What they really offer to you, less than trying to focus too much on that, is if you have any mountains nearby, then obviously mountains are going to make this bananas. If not, then all you're assessing this on is the estate thing. I think Cultural Blitz is still like so unbelievably powerful that Zhou is top tier by itself based off of this alone. But whether or not it's the most powerful in the game kind of does depend. And I think it depends explicitly on whether or not you can line up Confucian schools pretty well, because +5 science per adjacent mountain is basically a free population per adjacent mountain. A little weaker, but it's pretty close to that. And so how I'm gonna rank it is I'm gonna put them in OP above Mycenaeans because they do have the estate ability. But I think it's really, really close between these two. So I think other than the Sumerians, I think this is a pretty accurate description of the things. Like, namely, I'm not usually that embarrassed to take any of the ancient cultures because I'm not really looking to stay in ancient culture for very long. I'm in fact aiming to grab something, get the hell out of ancient culture as quickly as I can, and get into the classical era where all the really good civilizations are. And so what you should be looking to do is take one of the OP ones if you can while delaying it, because the strongest thing here, like the real rank 1 over here, is just be a tribe for one more turn until it's not, and you run out of space and everything's terrible. But like Neolithic is a very powerful tribe to be, because you get tons of free influence from fighting mammoths, and so you have to balance that against all of the rest of these. And so just understanding like when things are good and under which circumstances they are good, I think is helpful. That's Walker. Take care.